A lot of Dune fans are wanting to know, in particular, about the Spacing Guild and how they will be handled in Dune Messiah, especially with Dune Part 2 omitting them towards the end. It does leave some things up in the air about how they could possibly adapt the story for Dune Messiah. The Spacing Guild itself is one of the primary components of what makes the universe of Dune work. So this is a tripod society with the Emperor and the houses of the Landsraad and the Spacing Guild, with the Bene Gesserit, of course, being that hidden element in the background, pulling the strings. So in this post-AI, post-thinking machine world, the spice, that's what they use to chart safe paths through space. So it's guild members. When they become navigators after consuming the spice melange, they open up their powers of prescience. And because of that, they're able to foresee safe paths through space. Now, in Dune Part 1, they did touch on this, and we did see a highliner vessel. This is what actually does the job of folding space, but it is the navigators themselves that make sure that their path is safe when they do so. So there is no computers, there is no navigational charting that they rely on machines for. That is all on the part of humans who have become advanced to the point, with the help of the spice, to foresee that safe path. 1 in 10 ships would be lost without navigation. So that's how they were able to maintain this monopoly, because it's not really worth the risk if there is a safer alternative and a much faster alternative, and how people or the different civilizations across all these planets can trade with each other and travel. They have this safe and fast alternative. So they have an utter monopoly, which is why they are situated in such a significant position in the Empire. They have quite a bit of weight when it comes to the political landscape. Not so much that they care about who's in position of power. They need to make sure that the spice continues to flow, and they can throw around their weight in the fact that they have this monopoly on interstellar transport. So it's definitely in the houses of the Landsraad's best interest to make sure that the guild is happy. But when it comes to Denis Villeneuve's adaptation so far, Dune Part 1 I really did like, because it did show the Spacing Guild. It showed those representatives. They were clad in these very ornate, clergy-like outfits. I love this whole scene of the Emperor granting stewardship of Arrakis to Duke Leto on Caladan, and his whole entourage was there to finalize things. That was really cool that they were there. They were present as witnesses of this event. We saw the highliner in space, but then we see the ships coming out of it and landing on the planet. What's interesting, though, too, is we don't actually see them fold space. The highliner is just there, and it looks like it's a portal. You can see through one end the planet Kitane, I believe, and then as they go through it, they land on Caladan, which is different. And Denis Villeneuve did promise, after Dune Part 1 came out, that he would reveal how that worked, how space travel worked in their interpretation of it. So it is a bit different, but they did say that navigators were used, because that's something that Duke Leto specifically asked the Mentat Thufir Hawat, how much did it cost them to do all of this ceremony to finalize him taking over Arrakis? And he said 3 navigators, and how much Solari it cost, which was a very high price. And since then, it was such a mystery of how this worked. But we did get the sense of it. We see Paul, he's learning about Arrakis, he's learning about the spice, and in these recordings, we hear that the spice is integral to space travel. And they specifically say that the navigators use it to foresee safe paths through space. So we know its use. But one thing that a lot of fans had issue with Dune Part 2, we don't see them at all. We don't even see a highliner in orbit at the very end. We see the great houses, ships in space, and we see the Emperor's ship that we saw in Part 1 land on Arrakis, but there's no highliner ever seen in orbit. So it is very strange that they were omitted. Even if they weren't in the entourage, that clergy-like navigators that we saw, I did think it was strange that the ship wasn't there, because they did establish in Part 1 that it is absolutely necessary for travel. We saw the Highliner in space over Caladan, and we saw the Highliner in space over Arrakis during the Harkonnen siege on the Atreides. So that was a bit frustrating, and we didn't get to see that. And it has been frustrating for fans too, because they are so integral to this universe. And it does present challenges for Dune Messiah, because they take very much a more direct hand in the outworking of events. We have a navigator in Edric, who is a part of the conspiracy to take down Paul Atreides, to loosen his absolute control over the Empire. That's how Dune Messiah begins. All of these other factions are coming together to end his control over everything. Does make you wonder, are they going to do some exposition or something to portray just how important the Spacing Guild is to civilization? So at the end of the story of Dune, in the book, there are guild representatives present with the Emperor's entourage, which was frustrating for me to think about it, because you had all of those costumes, you had everything there. And in the book, they are very much jealous of their privacy as they are of their monopoly. So as far as the actual navigators that are in the Highliners that are charting safe paths through space, no one had ever seen one of those in that first book. But we did see guild representatives at the end, and Paul was directly addressing them because he's threatening to take control over the universe because he has direct control over the spice. Paul knows how to end spice production. And he says, you know that I have the power to do so. You can foresee it. And they're the ones that say yes, basically saying to the Emperor, yeah, you kind of have to do what he says. And thus goes the saying, he who can destroy a thing has the true control over it. So they are the ones that lent credence to Paul's threat and ensured that he was in charge. Paul did do the legal means to ascend to the throne in marrying Princess Irulan, but everyone else had to fall in line because he had such utter control over the spice. He had that power to destroy it, to end the sandworm life cycle, which is where spice originates. So in the movie, that is all kind of different. It plays out very differently. The spice is threatened, but I guess it's more simplified. He threatens to use atomics to destroy the spice fields, his family atomics, which that part is true. He did have those. He used them against the shield wall before the attack at the Battle of Arrakeen, and he threatens to use them again for the spice fields. And then at the very end, the great houses refuse to acknowledge Paul's ascendance to the throne. And that's what starts Muad'Dib's jihad, because Paul says, lead them to paradise then. And they go off on their holy war. So very different circumstances surrounding the jihad, why it starts, but also the Spacing Guild's role. So because it was omitted or greatly diminished, this does present a ton of challenges for how Dune Messiah will be portrayed, because they participate so significantly in the story. As I was saying before, the Spacing Guild are such a foundational element to Frank Herbert's Dune. You really have to put the work in to establish why they are so significant to this story. This is a universe built off of multiple factions, all vying for the advancement of their own interests and their own agenda. And for the Spacing Guild, the spice above all is what they care about, because spice is so addictive. And for ones that have this prolonged exposure to it, they would die without it. So Paul had such a strong hold on the Spacing Guild through that. He could control the spice and therefore could control the supply of it to the guild. So he has them wrapped around his little finger by the end of Dune. It definitely puts them in a position to want to wrest control from that. It is interesting too, because they are one of the principal schools that came out of the Butlerian Jihad, which was this purge of all thinking machines and AI computers. And the Spacing Guild, once they had this monopoly, it even changed the imperial calendar. The year is like 10,191 AG, with the AG meaning after guild, which is after the guild established their monopoly. They are very much integrated into this universe. But there is some concerns because Dune Part 2 did omit them. It was very disappointing not to see them and to at least throw their hat into the ring as to this different change in power and leadership, because they would have something to say about it. But they did do it. They did omit them, and they kind of made the Bene Gesserit take on a bigger role in light of their absence. And that's something that they're going to have to correct for Dune Messiah. And this is a concern. I mean, I guess you could do it without them, but it would change the story so much and diminish the complexity and strangeness of Frank Herbert's story. So if you're not going to adapt it, if you're not going to adapt all these different institutions, then what's the point? You take away from those delicious layers of lore by not including them. And that's something that is a bigger concern. Will he just, again, lean more on the Bene Gesserit behind this conspiracy than he should? He has done that. He says it's a very Bene Gesserit focused adaptation. That was his excuse for not including Thufir Hawat, even though Stephen McKinley Henderson filmed scenes with Austin Butler's Feyd-Rautha. His reasoning behind ultimately deleting them or leaving them on the cutting room floor was that his adaptation, his particular interpretation, was very Bene Gesserit focused. He thought that those scenes would take away from their influence in the story. It would be really unfortunate if, again, he decided to sideline these other factions to just make it more about the Bene Gesserit, to make it more about the space witches. And I think people are tired of that actually now, because it is kind of becoming a trope. There's quite a bit of media that is solely focused on just witches in general in other IPs. And even with Dune itself, like Dune Prophecy, that spinoff is solely Bene Gesserit focused. And I really hope that in the next season, we'll branch out into fully fleshing out these other elements that make up Frank Herbert's world. This is what makes it stand out as different, and it would be a real shame if they didn't explore all of the other elements and layers to this storied universe. And ultimately, I think it actually achieves the opposite of what maybe Denis Villeneuve wanted. I think it actually diminishes the Bene Gesserit. Having them have more control, I think, actually backfired on showcasing them as these ultimate puppet masters. And I don't think that Denis Villeneuve did himself any favors by omitting, even if it was small at the time, it could have bigger ramifications later, because you have these other factions that are now playing a much more significant role in the actual story. I know that he streamlined the story very much, but for your last film, I really do think that you should just go out guns a-blazing when it comes to lore. Like, really fully embrace the strange and the complex and the rich lore of this universe. I think we can all agree, I think everyone's on the same page when it comes to this. Like, you have to showcase this. And I think this is necessary to kind of reestablish the world again. You've already shown that they need the spice. So I think it would already be very strange to again omit them. And honestly, if you do, it would only take away from what you're trying to do. And this is Dune. If you don't want to adapt these different factions, then ultimately you don't want to adapt Frank Herbert's Dune. The final product would end up feeling more generic and way too streamlined. We need to have this feel like Dune. We need it to be unique. It's Dune when all of the pieces on the chessboard are in play. That's my final thoughts on this. You cannot do Dune Messiah without them. I think it's way too much work also on the Bene Gesserit faction itself. I think it would actually make it more complicated to try to work them out of the story than to just put them in it. I think if you tried to streamline it, it would just make your challenge of adapting the story that much more difficult and kind of confusing. Because that was one thing that actually confused me about Dune Part 2, specifically with Reverend Mother Mohiam's moves and motivations. Because in Dune Part 1, it was a original scene that seemed like it was kind of teasing the omission of Count Fendring, but she was sent there on behalf of the Emperor to the Baron to finalize arrangements for their attack on House Atreides on Arrakis. But her mission and her agenda, she asked him if he could spare Lady Jessica and her son, that we have our own plans. Can you just give them the dignity of exile? She was making these moves for the preservation of Paul's bloodline, which is integral to their plans for the Kwisatz Haderach. But in Dune Part 2, it's kind of strange because then we see her being the one that was the ultimate mastermind behind the attack, with the ultimate goal to erase or destroy the Atreides bloodline. And definitely that is not something that Mohiam would ever have done. She only ever made moves to preserve the genetic bloodlines. These are very precious. This is 10,000 years of work. So she wouldn't have just written them off just because they showed signs of rebelliousness. it did make things a bit confusing there for their motivations. And I think it would only continue moving forward with Dune Messiah if they are the sole conspirators behind the plot to take down Paul Atreides. It would be much simpler, I think, to just adapt as best to your ability what Frank Herbert had written. I think it makes it much more complicated and threatens to make it convoluted to move around and omit these factions like the Spacing Guild and the Bene to rework the story to make up for their absence. Doing so would certainly threaten to make the story feel very generic, and certainly would fail to capture the essence of what makes Frank Herbert's Legendarium so fascinating. But I'm curious to know what you think needs to be included in Denis Villeneuve's adaptation of Dune Messiah. Do you agree that the Spacing Guild needs to be given a significant role in the film? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did, and be sure to subscribe for more Dune and other sci-fi and fantasy news, theories, and lore. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, you can leave a super thanks or join as a YouTube member for early access to new videos and other perks. You can also check out my Patreon page for exclusive content. Thank you all so much for your support, and as always, have a very nerdy day.